Niluna Sleep Stories, Rainy and Quiet Town. Hello, and welcome back. If you're here right now listening to this, then I want you to know you chose well tonight. You chose stillness. You chose rest. And that is a quiet, beautiful thing. Take a slow breath in and let it go. There is nothing you need to do right now. Nowhere you need to be. Whatever the day has asked of you, you can set it down now, gently, like a coat by the door. You are here, and here is enough. You're listening to Niluna Sleep Stories, a quiet corner of the world made for those who need to unwind, to drift, to let the mind soften at the edges and find its way to sleep. Every story you'll find here is written with one intention: to slow everything down. No sudden sounds, no rushing, only words and warmth, and the gentle company of a voice that is in no hurry at all. Tonight's story is called Rainy and Quiet Town. It's a story about a man, a window, and the soft sound of October rain, about the way memory rises slowly, like steam from a warm cup, about a small town that holds its people the way good places do. Quietly, completely, without needing to be asked. There are no dragons here, no urgency, only rain on the roof, a lamp by the window, and a life, ordinary and full, drifting through an afternoon. But first, before we begin, I have a small, gentle question for you. Where are you right now, as you listen to this? Are you tucked into bed? The blankets pulled up close? Are you somewhere far from home, in a hotel room with the curtains drawn? Are you on a sofa with a warm drink, or lying on your back in the dark, staring at a ceiling you know by heart? I would love to know. Leave a comment below. Just tell me where you are in the world tonight. Your city, your country, or simply how the night feels where you are. Are you somewhere cold? Is it raining there too? There is something I find deeply beautiful about knowing that people in so many different corners of the world are all listening to the same story, in the same quiet, all finding their way to rest together. You are not alone in this, not even a little. If this is your first time here, welcome, truly. Niluna Sleep Stories is here for you every time the night feels too loud, or the mind refuses to stop, or you simply need a voice to walk with you gently into sleep. If you'd like to come back, and I hope you will, subscribing to the channel means a new story will be waiting for you whenever you need one. No pressure, just a quiet door always unlocked. And if tonight's story helps you sleep, if it gives you a few minutes of peace, if it makes the night a little softer, please do leave a like. It means more than you know. It tells me that this is worth making. And it is, as long as you are here. All right, are you comfortable? Is the light low enough? Is there something warm nearby? A blanket, a pillow, something soft against your hands? Good. Then let's go somewhere quiet together. Imagine a small town, a grey October afternoon, rain on the windows, a man in an armchair, his hands around a warm cup of tea, watching the drops slide down the glass one by one, thinking of nothing in particular and everything at once. Let your eyes close if they want to. Let your breathing slow. Let the words carry you. This is Rainy and Quiet Town, and it begins right now. Chapter 1. The Window and the Rain. The rain had been falling since morning, and Martin didn't mind at all. He sat in the old armchair beside the window, the one with the faded green upholstery that had softened and shaped itself to the curves of his body over the years, and he let the sound of it wash over him like something he had been waiting for, without knowing it. Outside, Millhaven was doing what it always did in the rain. It quieted. It folded inward. The streets turned to mirrors, the storefronts dimmed their amber lights a little, and the whole small town seemed to exhale and lean back, content to let the water have its say. He was 53 years old, and he had lived in this house for 21 of those years, and in this town for all of them, save one restless semester in the city that he did not like to think about too closely. The house sat on a gentle slope at the end of Sycamore Lane, the last house before the road curved and became a track and then a field, and then the dark tree line of the old Hargrove woods. His neighbour, Mrs. Powley, had her curtains drawn. The house across the lane, the yellow one that always needed painting, was dark and quiet. Its owners presumably somewhere warmer, somewhere with less rain. Martin had no desire to be anywhere warmer. He had made his tea. He had turned the lamp on low. He was exactly where he wanted to be. A car moved slowly down the wet street, its headlights sweeping briefly across his ceiling before dissolving into the grey. He watched the tail lights recede and disappear around the bend, and then there was nothing again but the rain and the sound of his own breath and the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. He wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the warmth move up into his palms. And he looked at the window the way a man looks at something he has loved for a long time and never needed to explain. There is a particular kind of quiet that only rain can make. Not silence, but something softer than silence. A sound that fills all the empty spaces so that nothing else is required. The drops came steadily, without drama. No thunder. No wind worth speaking of. Just the patient, unhurried fall of October rain moving through the air and finding the gutters and the gardens and the roof tiles and the wide, still puddle that always formed at the edge of the driveway where the pavement had settled a little over time. He had always meant to fix that dip in the pavement. He had never fixed it. The puddle had become part of the place, as reliable as the oak tree in the backyard and the creak in the third step and the way the kitchen smelled of old wood in the mornings. Martin took a slow sip of his tea and closed his eyes for a moment. The rain kept going. Of course it did. Rain didn't need anyone to watch it in order to fall. Chapter 2. What Memory Does in the Rain. He was not sure when his mind had drifted back to the summer he was 17. It happened the way these things always happened. Not as a decision, not as a chosen act of remembrance, but as a slow surfacing, like something that had been resting quietly at the bottom of a deep pool and had simply, without asking permission, risen to the surface. One moment he was watching the rain, and the next he was somewhere else entirely, still in his body, still in the chair, still hearing the drops on the glass, but also standing in a field on a hot afternoon 40 years ago, barefoot in the grass, squinting into a white sky. The summer he was 17 had been the driest in Millhaven for 20 years, or so his father had said. And fathers in that era said things like that with a kind of proud authority that brooked no question. The grass had gone yellow by July. The creek behind the Hargrove property had shrunk to a dark brown trickle between stones. And yet the young people of Millhaven had not seemed to mind the heat much, because they were 17 and 18, and they had the particular gift of not minding things that older people found unbearable, the way youth absorbs discomfort and turns it somehow into the substance of joy. He remembered very clearly a girl named Caroline March, She had moved to Millhaven the previous autumn with her mother and a younger brother named James, who kept frogs in a jar. Caroline had dark hair that she wore in a single braid, and she read books during lunch at school, and she laughed at things before she understood them, and then explained her laughter afterwards in a way that somehow made the joke better rather than worse. He had been in love with her from the moment she sat down beside him in Mr. Hollis's geography class and asked to borrow a pencil and did not give it back for 2 weeks, by which time it had become, without either of them saying so, an excuse. He had been young, and the summer had been long, and the town had been so perfectly itself that the world beyond it had seemed like a rumour. They had spent much of that dry summer at the edge of the Hargrove Pond, which kept its water longer than the creek did, and which had an old dock on the north side where you could sit with your feet hanging over the edge and watch the dragonflies and say very little, and still feel entirely understood. Caroline brought her books. Martin brought, more often than not, nothing at all, because he was the kind of boy who was content to simply exist in a place if the place was right. Sometimes James came too and sat at the far end of the dock trying to catch things, and the sound of his small splashes was a comfortable background, like music in another room. One afternoon in late August, a single cloud had moved over the pond and released a sudden brief shower, one of those summer rains that comes out of a clear blue sky, as if the sky has simply changed its mind for a moment. They had not moved. They sat there, the three of them, getting wet, and James had laughed and tried to catch the drops in the frog jar, and Caroline had tipped her face back and closed her eyes, and Martin had watched her do this, and had felt something he did not have a word for at the time, and would spend the next several years looking for. The rain had stopped in 5 minutes. The sky went blue again. Their shirts dried in half an hour, stiffened slightly with the dried water smelling of summer and lake. Martin had thought, in a dim, inarticulate way, that he would like to stay in this afternoon for a very long time. He did not know then that he would stay in it for the rest of his life. Chapter 3. The town as it was Millhaven in those days had been somewhat smaller, though it had never been particularly large. It had a main street called, unimaginatively but accurately, Main Street, along which stood a hardware store, a pharmacy, a bakery run by a family named Ostrowski that made a particular kind of rye bread that Martin still sometimes dreamed about, a diner, a small library that smelled strongly of wood varnish and quietly of paper, and a haberdashery that nobody quite understood the economic case for, but which had persisted through decades with quiet stubbornness. There had been a cinema with 2 screens where the older teenagers went on Friday nights, not necessarily to watch the films. There had been a post office whose postmistress, a Mrs. Albright, knew the contents of every package and the business of every sender, and made no secret of either. Martin had known all of these places with the easy, unthinking intimacy of a child who has grown up in a small town and never had cause to see it from the outside. He had known which step on the library stairs creaked. He had known that the Ostrowski bakery put its unsold loaves in a basket by the back door on Saturday afternoons, free to whoever came. He had known that the old elm tree on the corner of Main and Birch harboured a family of starlings that objected loudly to anyone pausing beneath it, and that this had made it an effective and amusing obstacle to lingering conversations with people one wished to avoid. He had known the faces of every shopkeeper and the names of most of their children, and the rough outlines of most of their sorrows, because in a town that size sorrows did not stay private for very long. He had grown up feeling, without ever articulating it to himself, that the town was a kind of second skin, that walking its streets was a form of ease unavailable anywhere else. The city, he had tried the city, that one restless semester, 20 years old, and certain that something necessary awaited him there, had been the opposite of this. The city had been information without context, faces without histories, a relentless horizontal momentum that carried you along whether you wanted to go or not. He had lasted until December. He had come home on a Sunday in a light snow and found his mother in the kitchen making soup, and she had not said anything except to ask if he wanted bread with it, and that had been somehow exactly right. Now, looking out at the rain-soaked lane, he could see how little the essential character of Millhaven had changed, even as the specific details had shifted and worn. The haberdashery was gone, replaced by a place that sold candles and artisanal soap. The cinema had become a theatre, still with 2 screens. The Ostrowski bakery had closed when old Mr. Ostrowski died, and the building was now a small accountancy firm, and sometimes Martin still caught a ghost of that rye bread smell when he passed the door, or thought he did. The library smelled the same. Mrs. Albright had retired, and her post office with her, replaced by a counter inside the pharmacy, which was somehow both more efficient and profoundly less interesting. But the streets were the same streets. The light fell the same way in the afternoons. The rain made the same sound on the same rooftops, and the same puddle formed at the end of the same dip in the same pavement. The tree line of the Hargrove woods was still dark and patient at the edge of town, though the Hargrove family itself was long gone. The town persisted, changed and unchanged, the way all the things one loves persist, imperfectly, gradually, essentially. Chapter 4. Caroline, and after Caroline Marsh had left Millhaven at 18, as some people do, and had not come back, as some people don't. She'd gone to university in the East and then to a city in another country for a postgraduate degree, and the letters had become cards, and the cards had become sparse, and the sparse cards had become nothing, not with any rupture or intention, but simply with the natural attrition of distance and time and lives moving in different directions at the speed that lives do. Martin had heard, through the reliable telegraph of small-town knowledge, that she had married a man who worked in international development, that she had lived in 3 different countries, that she had children, that she was well. He had felt at each of these reports a small, soft ache that was not quite grief and not quite regret, but something in the neighbourhood of both, a tenderness for the person he had been and for the afternoon at the pond, and for the brief shower of that August rain that had asked nothing of either of them. He had married at 28. Her name was Ruth, and she was from a town 2 hours north of Millhaven, and she had come to work as the deputy head teacher at the primary school, and had stayed, initially because the position was good, and then had stayed because she had found reasons that had nothing to do with the position. She and Martin had been together for 19 years before she had died, 4 years ago now, of something swift and thorough that the doctors had named in Latin, and that had made very little difference whether it was named or not. He still slept on his side of the bed. He still made 2 cups of tea in the morning before remembering. He was, he thought, as fine as a man could reasonably be expected to be. She had loved the rain. She had said once that rain was the sound of the world thinking, and he had laughed, and she had been right. Their son, Daniel, was 25 and lived in a larger city to the south where he worked in something involving computers and seemed happy in the rapid, slightly distracted way of young people who have found a forward momentum they trust. He called on Sundays reliably, and the calls were warm and slightly too short and sometimes awkward in the way that calls between fathers and adult sons often are, both of them loving each other with an ease they could not quite translate into conversation, but trying. Martin was proud of him. He was certain of this even when he could not articulate it, and he had learned by now that certainty was enough and articulation would come in its own time or not at all. He looked at the rain. He looked at the clock. 3:30 in the afternoon, the light already soft and grey, October doing what October does with a kind of weary thoroughness. He would not go out. There was nowhere particularly to go. He had retired from his position at the county surveyor's office 2 years ago, and the days had a different shape now. Not better or worse, but different, wider and less structured, with long stretches of nothing that he was learning, slowly, to move through without discomfort. It had taken a year to stop feeling that the emptiness was failure. It had taken another several months to understand that it was, in fact, a kind of space, and that space was not the same thing as absence. Chapter 5. Small hours of the afternoon. Around 4 o'clock, Martin got up to make more tea. The kitchen was cool and still, the window above the sink giving onto the back garden where the oak tree stood patient and dark. In the rain, its leaves mostly down now, lying in wet layers on the grass. He had not raked them yet. He would rake them eventually, or he would not. And either way the spring would come, and the garden would manage. Ruth had been the gardener, strictly speaking. He had been the one who carried the heavy things and the one who sometimes sat in the garden on summer evenings without doing anything in particular, which Ruth had told him was a talent, and he had chosen to take at face value. He put the kettle on and stood by the window while it heated. In the garden, a blackbird moved carefully across the wet lawn, pausing, tilting its head, moving again. He watched it with the quiet attention he had for small creatures going about their business, the attentiveness that asked nothing of them and expected nothing back. The bird found something, a worm likely, pulled up by the rain, and dealt with it efficiently, and moved on. Martin had always liked blackbirds. Ruth had liked robins. He had told her once that this said something fundamental about the difference in their characters, and she had thrown a tea towel at him with great accuracy. The kettle boiled. He made the tea and brought it back to the chair, settling into it again with a slight exhale that was not quite a sigh and not quite contentment, but contained elements of both. The rain continued. The clock ticked. Outside, Millhaven went about the slow business of a rainy afternoon, its people warm inside or hurrying between one shelter and the next, collars up, umbrellas out, faces down against the wet. He thought about his father, who had died at 81 and who had in his last years spent a great deal of time sitting by windows. Martin had been impatient with this once. He had thought, in the brisk and well-meaning way of the middle-aged, that his father should go out more, do more, engage more, as if engagement were a cure for the particular weariness of great age. He understood now something of what those window vigils had been. Not withdrawal, not defeat. Simply the discovery that the world, viewed from a certain stillness, had a great deal to offer, that the world, viewed from within the middle of it, tended to drown out. There was the sound of rain, there was the warmth of the tea, there was the lamp casting a pool of amber on the book that lay open, face down on the side table, a novel he had started 3 weeks ago and was proceeding through with pleasant slowness, not hurrying, allowing the story to take the time it took. There was the shape of the room around him, the familiar geography of the objects that had accumulated here over years, the bookshelf, the photographs, the small painting of a harbour that Ruth had found at a market, and that he had pretended to like until he actually did. There was the weight of his own body in the chair, the slight heaviness of limbs that had carried him for 53 years without complaint, more or less. He was in the middle of his life, or perhaps past the middle, and the rain was falling, and he was home, and these were not small things. Chapter 6. What the Rain Knows. By 5 o'clock, the light outside had shifted from grey to something darker, and the street lamps at the end of the lane had come on, their yellow light catching the falling drops and turning them briefly visible, each one a small bright thing descending through a cone of light before vanishing again into the dark below. Martin watched this with the particular pleasure he took in small visual effects. The way light behaved in rain was one of them. The way steam moved above a cup was another. The way shadows moved on a wall when a car passed slowly in the street. He was a man who had, over the years, become increasingly attentive to things that cost nothing, and asked nothing and offered themselves without condition. He thought, not unhappily, about the length of his life so far. There was a way of measuring a life by its events, the births, the deaths, the marriages, the moves, the jobs begun and ended, the decisive moments where one path closed and another opened. By this measure his life had been not uneventful, but perhaps unadventurous, at least by certain standards. One town, one career, one marriage, one child, one house on one lane at the end of which the woods stood waiting. He had not climbed mountains or crossed oceans or changed the world in any particular way that he knew of. He had surveyed land and found his boundaries. He had raised a son. He had loved his wife. But there was another way of measuring, and it had to do not with events but with accumulation, with the slow accretion of ordinary moments that, taken together, constituted a life in the way that individual threads taken together constitute cloth. The 10,000 cups of tea, the 10,000 sunrises seen from one window or another, the 10,000 conversations, most of them about nothing much, but warm with the presence of the people who were present in them. The walks in the Hargrove woods in all 4 seasons, the particular pleasure of the first fire of autumn, the particular pleasure of the last fire of spring, the way Ruth had laughed, which had been sudden and total, and which had always surprised him even after years of knowing it was coming. The way Daniel, as a small child, had come downstairs at 6 in the morning and climbed into the bed between them and immediately fallen back to sleep, as if that was the only place in the world worth sleeping. All of this was still present, Martin thought. Not gone. Memory was not loss. It was a different kind of having. The summer at the pond was not over. It was simply complete. The years with Ruth were not absent. They were everywhere in this room, in the painting and the bookshelf and the way the furniture was arranged, and the fact that there was a garden out there at all, because she had wanted a garden, and so there was one. The past was not behind him. It was the substance he stood on. The rain eased slightly, then resumed. He could hear it in the gutters, a steady running sound like a quiet conversation in another room. He shifted in the chair, tucked his feet up a little, pulled the blanket across his legs. An old blanket, dark blue, soft with washing, and reached for the book without opening it, just holding it, because he was not quite ready to leave where he was. Chapter 7. The town at evening Millhaven at 5:30 on a rainy October evening had a quality that Martin had never heard adequately described, though he had sometimes tried. It was something to do with the way the lights in the windows of the houses down the lane made the lane itself seem warmer, though the warmth was in the houses and not the lane. It was something to do with the proportion of darkness to light at this hour, enough of each to create a balance that felt, against all reason, like a kind of safety. It was something to do with the familiar rhythm of the place, the same cars coming home, the same figures moving between the warm rectangles of front doors and the wet grey street, the same dog at the end of the lane walking its owner, with the philosophical urgency that dogs bring to rain walks. He had watched this lane through all the seasons of his adult life. He had watched it from this chair in summer evenings when it was still light at 9 and the air smelled of cut grass, and someone, somewhere, always seemed to be having a barbecue. He had watched it on winter mornings when it was white and still, and the sound of his own movements in the house seemed too large. He had watched it on the morning after Ruth died, when the lane had been utterly ordinary, just the lane, just the light, just the usual traffic. And this had seemed, for a moment, like a kind of violence, and then, later, like a kind of mercy. The town had held him through all of it, not dramatically, not with any particular intention, but simply by being what it was, consistent, small, given to quiet. He thought of the people in the houses along the lane, most of whom he knew, at least in the way you know people in a small town, their routines, their shapes in windows, their approximate sorrows and pleasures, the sound of their voices calling to children or to each other across the ordinary distances of ordinary life. He thought of the people he had grown up with who were still here, who had stayed or returned, and the ways they had aged into themselves with varying degrees of grace. He thought of the people who had left and were somewhere else now, living their larger or smaller lives, carrying Millhaven with them in ways they might not always be aware of. He did not regret staying. He had examined this question at various points in his life with varying degrees of seriousness, and the answer had always been the same: no. Not because he lacked imagination or ambition, he was not entirely without either, but because the life that had presented itself here had turned out to be sufficient, which was not the same as small. The mistake people made, he had come to think, was in conflating scale with significance. The big life and the small life were not in competition. They were simply different shapes of the same possibility, and what mattered was not the shape but the attention you brought to it. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease. He could tell by the change in the sound, the roof drum quieting, the gutter rush softening, the drops on the window less frequent and more deliberate, each one landing and sliding without the company of others. In an hour, perhaps, it would stop. The lane would shine, clean and dark under the street lamps. The air would smell of wet earth and wet leaves, that particular autumn smell that he had been breathing for 53 Octobers, and that still moved something in him each time. A response so old and deep it no longer needed interpreting. Chapter 8. Before the Quiet Comes. Martin's eyes had grown heavy without him noticing. This often happened in the chair in the late afternoon, the combination of warmth and rain and the amber lamp and the accumulated quiet of an ordinary day working on him as thoroughly as a sleep draught. He was not alarmed by this. He was, if anything, grateful for it. For the body's willingness at a certain hour to simply suggest that things were all right, that nothing required immediate attention, that here was a space in which to be still. He thought, in the vague way of a mind beginning to loosen at the edges, of the boy he had been at the pond, of the heat and the dragonflies and the sound of James's small splashes, of Caroline tipping her face up into the sudden rain, of how completely and innocently they had inhabited that afternoon, with no sense of it as something that would be carried forward, no understanding that the present moment was always in the process of becoming the past that would later become memory, round and round, until one day you sat in a chair by a window in a rainy town and felt the whole of it present in you at once, not with grief but with something more like astonishment at how much a life could hold. The lamp made a small circle of warmth on the ceiling. The book lay in his lap, still closed. Outside, the rain went on with its patient work, falling on the garden and the oak tree and the unsolved dip in the pavement and the empty lane and the sleeping shapes of the rooftops. And beyond them, on the dark tree line of the woods where nothing much had changed in 100 years, and beyond that on the hills and the fields and the river in the valley, and all the quiet, small distances of the countryside going about its ancient, unhurried business without needing to be observed. Sleep, when it came, would come like rain, not as an ending, but as a continuation by other means. He thought of Daniel, somewhere south of here, in a lit apartment, working or resting, moving through his young life with its proper energies and its proper uncertainties. He thought of him with a love that had no need of expression, because it was structural, load-bearing, present in everything whether spoken of or not. He thought of how Daniel had as a teenager found Millhaven confining, and how he had let him find it so, without arguing, understanding that this was how it was supposed to work, the young chafing against what contains them until they are ready to choose their own containers, and how the choice was never really about the place, but about the person, about becoming large enough to understand that the size of a life is not determined by its geography. The rain was still falling, softer now, a whisper where it had been a conversation. The town was settling into its evening quiet, a quiet that was not absence but the presence of comfort, of 100 small lives arranged against the dark, each one warm inside its own particular circumstances, each one held by the same damp October air, the same slow rain, the same darkness coming down from the hills with its customary patience and its customary gifts. Martin closed his eyes fully, at last. He did not fight it. The chair held him, the blanket held him. The warmth of the tea was still faintly in his hands. The rain moved through the gutters with a sound like a river heard at a distance, a sound so old and familiar that it had long since passed beyond hearing into something more like breathing, part of the quiet rhythm of a life that was, by any measure that mattered, entirely his own. The lamp stayed on. The clock kept its count. The rain fell. The town held still as small towns do in October evenings gathered into itself, patient, unhurried, asking nothing more of the night than that it arrive in its own good time and do what nights have always done. Carry the tired ones down into rest, hold them there gently, and return them, when the morning comes, to the ordinary, extraordinary world. He slept.